I thought it just picked up your voice from like across the room.
All right, so we're talking about the problems that we're going to have at this time period in the medieval church. Again, medieval is just another name for the Middle Ages, okay? Or the Dark Ages. And the church is the only thing that's holding all of society together at this time period. Everybody was part of the church at this time period. And the big argument is going to be between spiritual authority and temporal authority. The church and the state. Who has the power? Does the Pope have the power? Or does the kings have the power? Okay? And throughout most of the Middle Ages, the popes had exercised complete authority. They told the kings when they could be kings. But kings are starting to act a little bit more independent. And we're going to start to have some problems. And we're going to talk about all of them as we go through here. But there's a problem with, can you tax the church? Is it okay for a king to tax priests? That's an issue. Should priests be tried in state courts, or should they have their own courts? It's hard for us to imagine today, but the church had its own court. And if you committed a crime as a priest, you could get away with it a lot of the time because the civil authority had no way to punish you. They'd have to send you to Rome, and the Pope would determine whether or not you got punished. And they almost never punished their own people at the time period. Talk about a couple of these examples up here. Clericus legis is a Latin term, and it's a papal bull. You know what a bull is?
Yes. Like a...
Not that kind.
Okay.
You know what a bulletin board is?
Yes.
What's a bulletin board?
Like that.
Stuff on it.
That you put like messages on, right?
Yeah.
A bull is a message. A bulletin board is a board that you put messages on, a bull. February 5th, 1296, Pope Boniface VIII, great name, Boniface. Boniface VIII issues the papal bull Clericus legis, which basically says that the king cannot tax the church. The problem was the church had most of the money in Europe. And the kings, particularly the king of England and the king of France, were constantly at war. And they needed to raise money. So they started taxing the church. So the people would be raising this money. And this is hard in the church, because the church was already taxing its own parishioners. You know what a tithe is, right?
Yes.
Today when you tithe at church, you pass around the plate and you put $1 or $2 in, right? Well, tithe technically means 10%. And there used to be a tithe, a tax. And every member of the church had to pay 10% of their income to the church. And that money went all the way to Rome, to the Pope. That's how the Pope built these giant palaces at the time period. Beyond that, they had what they called Peter's pence, where for every dollar you made, a penny of it went to the church. And then there were other local taxes. So people were already taxed almost to death by the church. And now, the kings and queens want to tax those churches. They look at all that money and they go, we want our share. The Pope here, Pope Boniface VIII, says you have no authority to do that. And that's going to create problems between Boniface and particularly Philip in France. There's also the papal bull of Unum Sanctum. This just kind of goes over who has the ultimate authority. Do the popes have the authority, or does the kings have the ultimate authority? And the Pope in this particular bull says ultimate authority lies with the church. So if a king does something that the Pope disagrees with, the Pope can depose the king. And he had weapons he would use. One of the things that he does to Henry II, King of England, is he tells all the people of England that as long as Henry is on the throne, nobody can get any of the sacraments. There's no last rites for the dead. There's no Lord's Supper. None of that's happening. Marriages weren't happening. You couldn't be blessed upon your birth. There's no baptisms. None of that is happening. because the Pope and the King are disagreeing. Now think about what kind of power that is. If the people of your, the religious people of your kingdom believe that they can't go to heaven unless they get all these rites. You don't go to heaven if you're not baptized. You don't go to heaven if you're not, don't get last rites. If you don't do communion, you don't go to heaven. You can't get married outside of the church. All these things are there. That makes people rise up against their king often. In fact, Henry, they rise up against Henry so bad that he ends up going to the church, the most important church there in England, and he lets the bishop whip him with a whip as punishment in front of the people. That's how violent this stuff gets. There's also these ideas of the opposite idea, defensor passing, defensor of the peace, written by a guy named Marcellus of Padua. Marcellus of Padua argued the other side. He said, no, the church is in charge of church things. The state is in charge of everything else. The state can make its own laws. This guy was actually considered a heretic in his time period and was excommunicated. He was kicked out of the church. Now, later in life, that was reversed, but it was an interesting way that was going on. So there's lots of stuff happening at this time. We have heresies happening. You know what a heresy is? Heresy is a crime against the church. If you're a heretic, you are espousing some kind of a belief that is against the basic foundational beliefs of the church. You can be kicked out of church for it, excommunicated. We're going to have the great schism at this time period, where the church is going to break, and we talked about that the other day, into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. We're going to have, we call lay reform. That's where common people like you and I, start believing that we can read the Bible for ourselves. And you don't have to be educated in this stuff. You can figure things out yourself. And conciliarism, which has to do with church councils making decisions. Instead of the Pope, there's a council of priests that get together and say, this is what we believe. Okay? It's like democratizing the church. So what are these big theological differences? There are these groups of people called the Lollards and the Hussites. And the Lollards and the Hussites are heretical Christians. They are Christians. But they're going to start believing things that are different than what the church believes. And they're going to get big followers. They're going to be really big. Wycliffe and the Lollards are going to be big in England. John Huss and the Hussites are going to be big in the Bohemian nations and what becomes Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. So, Lollards was a derogatory term. It was profane. It was a very bad thing to say to somebody. It was a bad word. And it was given to people that are not educated. You were considered a Lollard if you didn't go to school to study religion, yet you still tried to teach religion. John Wycliffe was a Lollard, and he was the first person to translate the Bible into English. Until John Wycliffe's translation of the Bible, it was always written in Latin. Here's the problem. Usually the priest was the only person in the community that could speak Latin. So that means if you want to know what the Bible says, what do you have to do? You got to go through the priest. You can't read it for yourself. But the Lollards create a version of the Bible you can read yourself. Can you think of any reason why the church would be against you reading the Bible for yourself?
Because if you can't read it, they can twist it into anything they want and to get you to do anything.
Yeah, and twisting it is kind of, yes, they can, but I don't think it was always even intentionally twisted. We can read the same words and we can get different meanings out of things, okay? You can say something and somebody interprets it totally differently. If you've ever had a girlfriend, you know what this is like, okay? You say something, she gets mad at you, you have no idea why, all right? Well, the Bible is kind of like that, where it says things, but it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. John Wycliffe, putting the translation of the Bible, was empowering common people. That means he was weakening the church. Lots of things changed because of this. Give you some examples of just simple things that changed. Think of this off the top of my head. Y'all have heard the story of the coat of many colors, right? At some point in your life? Where had a coat made of many colors and they were very proud of their color, their coat, right?
That's the one.
We're talking about two different things.
I'm talking about Dolly Parton.
Dolly Parton's song is
Oh,
about
okay,
it
this
too.
is.
Well, I
But
said,
in the Bible story, they talk about, there's a movie called Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and Joseph has this very bright coat of many colors, and it's a symbol of his power, his religion. Well, that was a mistake that was made by John Wycliffe. The Bible doesn't actually say a coat of many colors, it says a coat with long sleeves. But still today, it's been repeated over and over again. It's where you can get things that change, that mess up whenever you make a translation. The other group are the Hussites. Excuse me. So the Hussites wanted people to have the freedom to preach themselves. Again, you can preach the Word of God yourself. They wanted communion for everybody. There were people in the Catholic Church that thought that you couldn't get communion unless you were a member in good standing of the church and ready to die. You had to be free of sin. So there were people that were denied communion. These guys say, no, anybody can do communion. They did believe in poverty of the church, of the clergy. They looked around and they went, our problem is the church is too rich. They're taking all our money. And think about it, how mad would you be if the church was taxing you while your bishops were living like kings? Quit playing around. So the Hussites wanted to take the church property. We call this expropriation. They literally wanted to go in, take the property from the church, and give it out to everybody else, redistribute all this wealth to the people. They believed in punishment for sins. And it didn't matter if you were rich or poor, or a priest or a bishop. Everybody should be punished the same. These are two big heresies. The Catholic Church didn't like either one of these guys. They didn't like the Lollards. They didn't like the Hussites. A lot of these Lollards end up coming to the United States later on as pilgrims and Puritans.
I'm guessing though they like the Lollards more than the.
No, they pretty much despised both of them. There was no fan of either one. The Hussites actually ended up being in wars with the church. This is just examples of where the battles happened. The Hussite campaign, all these purple areas are areas where the Hussites, large armies of angry Christians, attacked other Christians. This is Christian against Christian war. Okay?
So I'm guessing that the Lollards, they really just kind of had one big thing, like we're going against the church, and then
The Lollards were much more peaceful. They weren't trying to fight. So, the next question is, inside the church, what powers did we have? Or problems did we have? You had the popes and the councils fighting over who was in charge. The popes claimed to be the vicar of Christ. Popes get their authority through St. Peter. St. Peter was the first pope. And the Bible, if you read the Bible, Jesus says to Peter, you'll be the rock upon which this church will be built. Okay? That's the whole aspect of why the Pope has the authority. He was the first bishop of Rome, and all the other popes were bishops of Rome. Yeah.
Can you use restroom?
Yeah. So, they want all the authority. And they believed in what they called the infallibility of the Pope. The Pope can never be wrong because he's blessed by Christ. But then there were these councils of bishops, and they were democratizing the church and making votes on things. And sometimes the two disagreed. Who should have the ultimate power? And we ended up having fights. We're going to see three examples. We're going to see Pope Innocent III, Pope Boniface VIII, and finally the Avignon papacy that happens. And this is the church really just ripping itself apart. Pope Innocent III, what a great name. Y'all know when you become pope, you get to change your name, right? When you get to pick your name when you're a pope. It's like King of England, you get to pick what name you have. This guy is pretty much hated by a lot of people. He was one of the most powerful of the medieval church popes. The big deal about him is he claims absolute superiority over everything. He's the guy that's going to say, the Pope is in charge, I don't care what the council says, I'm in charge. He's going to rule up until his death. There's some mystery about his death. Some people speculate that he was murdered. Boniface VIII is super controversial. Super controversial. Boniface VIII is the guy that goes to war against King Philip IV of France and Henry II in English. He isn't just a pope, they call him the warrior pope. Boniface has a giant army of his own. And if you disagreed with him, he would hire mercenary armies to come and attack your village. This is the kind of Christianity that we're talking about here. He disagreed with this prominent family in Italy, and he actually went through and took their land away from them and took it over for the church. Finally, this pope is kidnapped by his adversaries. He's held as a prisoner for several months, and we kind of existed without a pope for a while. He did survive the attack. He did return back to Rome, dies a month later, again, probably poisoned, but that wasn't uncommon at this time period. They really didn't like him. Upon his death, we have a problem where we end up with multiple popes. 1309 to 1376. There are 7 popes in this time period, and they're all excommunicating each other. The King of France decides that he wants to name his own pope. The church picks a pope, the King of France picks a pope, and they end up going to war against each other. Ultimately, we call this the Avignon papacy because the church moved from Rome to Avignon in France. And they actually ended up controlling everything. The King of England had the Pope in his, the King of France had the Pope in his own country. That Pope was a guy named Clement V. So you had a Pope in Rome, a Pope in Avignon, and they both claim to be the only leader. It's confusing everybody. We sometimes call this the Babylonian captivity. It's what's going to cause the church ultimately to split into these 2 different groups here, the great schism. So you can see that there's not one great church anymore. You have the green areas. These green areas here are loyal to Rome. These pink areas here are loyal to Avignon, the French area. And Eastern Orthodox is over here. So these are all different types of Christianity. And they're all fighting each other. This is the Pope's Palace at Avignon. Kind of give you an idea of what it looked like. Still stands today.
What do you do, walk around?
The next question is, what do you do? What do you do in this time period when philosophy is dealing with science and faith? Do you trust science? They would call it reason back then. Do you trust reason or do you trust faith? Well, that's a tough one. This guy, Peter Abelard, came through here. And Peter Abelard said, you've got to do more than just trust your emotions and love God. You have to be able to prove God exists scientifically. Peter Abelard was considered a heretic in his time period because he's trying to use science. The church and science don't always get along. Today, he's accepted. If I see that phone out again while I'm talking, it's mine. Put it up. The other guy, this is the more important one to us in the West, is Thomas Aquinas. Saint Thomas of Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas said we can prove God through science, but we have to prove him through observation. We have to observe movement in the world around us. And they look at everything and they go, he looked at the heavens and he saw that planets move through telescopes and all this. And he said something had to start that movement. Well, what started it? Well, God is the prime mover. That's what starts everything. He observes cause and effect. He looks at things and if you do this, that happens. And it always happens. Why does it always happen? His reasoning was God. God was the cause of everything. He looked around and said nothing is permanent. Everything dies. But it has to have a creation. Something can't come from nothing. If I gave you nothing and told you to make something out of it, could you do it? No, nobody can. But somehow it happens in nature. And the argument here is God is the only thing that can do this. And he originates that from within himself. So he starts looking at all this. And he starts looking at people. And he starts saying people are a perfect example of the attainment of God. He called it the perfection. But what he meant was, I look at lower animals and I can look at different levels. The bug is less evolved than the monkey, and the monkey is different than man. And just as the monkey is different from man is different from God. It's kind of a strange concept. And then he just said, intelligence, the fact that we can reason things out. This means there is a God and he's blessed us. That's why we're not monkeys. That's why we're not whales or fish or chickens. They can't reason things out. We can reason things out. We have intelligence, and that was proof of God to him. There's also questions about church corruption. The church was running something called the Inquisition. Y'all ever heard of the Inquisition? If you were accused of heresy, you would get called before this group of priests whose job it was to determine whether or not you were guilty or innocent. And they had a couple of ways they could do this. They could do trial by combat, where they believed that if there were two people that had a disagreement, they would put them together and let them fight each other, and God would pick the correct one to win. God wouldn't let the villain win. Trial by combat. They had what they called compurgation, which was, this was a good strategy. I need to know whether or not you're guilty of a crime. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your hand here, okay? Then I'm going to heat up some really hot metal until it's liquid hot, and I'm going to pour it in your hand right here. If it burns you, you're guilty. Very few people were found innocent. They would do.
How are you not supposed to get burned?
God would protect you if you were innocent.
Oh yeah.
You must be guilty. The other thing they would do is they would look for people that were committing witchcraft. You know how you determine whether or not somebody was a witch? You burned them after they found out they were a witch. But this was the great strategy, how we found out if they were a witch. I need to know if you're a witch or not. Can you come here for a second? All right, so I've got my accused witch. This is what we're going to do.
Hocus pocus.
What we're going to do is we're going to tie him to a stick. I'm going to put a stick over here, okay? We're going to lash you to it. We're going to put that on a seesaw, like a lever, all right? And then we're going to drop you in the water
See if you
and leave you down there for about 10 or 12 minutes, okay? You ready?
No?
Okay, go sit
He's a
down.
whale.
Here's the deal. Here's the deal. If you're innocent, God will protect you and you won't die. if you're a winch, you're gonna drown.
Yeah, but for
What
12
did
minutes-
the,
for 12 minutes you won't die.
stick do?
But here's the funny part about it, here's the funny part about it.
You pass it.
According to Malleus Maleficorum, the book on how to tell this, they said, God will protect you, but there is an exception. There was one person that came up and didn't drown, was left underwater for 8 minutes, came back up and was still alive. And you know what they did? They said she must have used witchcraft to protect herself, and they burned her at the stake.
You left. So you told me you lived. You
Yeah.
after all that just.
Yeah. So this is what's going on with the Inquisition. They use torture extensively.
So you either died.
You either died or died. Yeah.
She sat there for 8 minutes.
Don't you love that system? I think that should be our discipline system around here.
Didn't they do something similar to that, like the Salem witch trials?
Yeah, they put you on.
In the Salem witch trials later, they used the same book. Yeah.
What did the stick do?
We also have these people called the Beguines or the Beggars, and these were monks or nuns that went and lived a life of poverty. Yes,
What did the stick do?
it just
It
gave.
was the seesaw.
It just gave something for us to put a seesaw, put on the seesaw. Had to lash you to something. All right.
No, I really don't.
Do you know what a seesaw is?
Yes, I know what a seesaw is.
Okay.
That gets us through this.
Balance the stick.
Wait, that's it?
That's it.